There's a plant growing along fence lines and in the neglected corners of American backyards that produces clusters of glossy, dark berries every summer. They look like something you would eat. Children pick them every year, and every year poison control centers take the calls. This is pokeweed, and I'm going to show you exactly how to identify it. Why children are drawn to it more than any other toxic plant in the country. What to do in the first 10 minutes if a child eats one. And the genuinely strange fact that families across the American South have been cooking and eating part of this same plant for 200 years. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the difference between them comes down to which part of the plant, at what stage of growth, and prepared in exactly the right way. Let me start with why children are the ones this plant reaches, because the reason is not carelessness. A small child does not evaluate a berry the way an adult does, because they are working from three simple facts. The berry is small enough to hold, it is a deep glossy purple that looks exactly like fruit, and it is hanging at the height of their hand. Pokeweed satisfies all three conditions better than almost any other plant in an American yard. The berries hang in long, drooping clusters, dark and shiny, arranged along a stem in a way that genuinely resembles a bunch of wild grapes. The stems holding them are a bright magenta pink, which is a color that draws the eye of a child from across a lawn. And the plant grows in exactly the places children play, meaning the back fence line, the gap behind the shed, the weedy corner beyond the mown grass, and the edge of a woodlot. Nobody plants pokeweed because it arrives on its own and it grows fast, and a great many parents have never learned its name. It is native across the eastern and central United States, and it has spread well beyond that range, which puts it in yards through most of the country. It favors disturbed ground with some sun, meaning fence lines, roadsides, ditches, the edges of fields, and the strip of neglected ground between a mown lawn and a tree line. In other words, it grows in the exact band of every American property that nobody maintains and nobody inspects. So let me give you the 4 marks that identify it, and they are all visible from across a yard. The first mark is the stem, and it is the most distinctive feature this plant has. A mature pokeweed stem is thick, smooth, and a striking magenta or deep purplish red, sometimes green at the base and turning to that vivid color as the season goes on. Nothing else in a typical American backyard produces a stem that color at that size. The second mark is the height, because pokeweed grows fast and grows large, commonly reaching 4 to 10 feet in a single season. It is not a small weed hiding in the lawn, since by August it stands taller than most of the people walking past it. The third mark is the berries, which begin as green, ripen through red, and end as a deep, glossy purple-black. They hang in long, drooping clusters called racemes, with the berries arranged along a central stalk, and each berry is slightly flattened with faint segments visible on its surface like a tiny pumpkin. The fourth mark is the leaves, which are large, smooth-edged and pointed, growing up to about a foot long, and arranged singly along the stem rather than in pairs. Put those together and you have a tall plant with a magenta stem, large, simple leaves, and drooping strings of dark, shiny berries. And the calendar matters here more than people expect, because this plant has a specific danger window. Through spring and early summer, the plant is green, leafy, and easy to walk past without noticing, and there's nothing on it that attracts a child at all. By midsummer, the flowers appear as small greenish-white clusters, and the stems begin turning that distinctive pink magenta. Then, from late summer into autumn, the berries ripen from green through red to that deep, glossy purple, and this is the period when nearly every exposure happens. So the weeks when the plant is at its most visually attractive to a child are exactly the weeks when the fruit is hanging in reach, which means late summer is when a parent should walk the fence line and look. Now let me explain what is actually in it, because the toxicity here is layered in a way most plants are not. Every part of pokeweed contains toxic compounds, and the concentration varies enormously depending on which part you're talking about. The root is by far the most toxic part of the plant, and it is the part nobody should ever eat, dig up carelessly, or handle without gloves. The stems and mature leaves come next, and they become more toxic as the plant ages through the season. The berries are the least toxic part, which is a sentence that needs immediate qualification because least toxic does not mean safe. The berries still cause genuine illness, and they are the part children actually eat, which is why they account for the overwhelming majority of exposure calls. And the scale of those calls is larger than most people would guess. Poison control centers across the United States handle tens of thousands of plant exposure cases every year, and the great majority of them involve children under the age of 6. Pokeweed sits consistently near the top of that list in the regions where it grows, alongside a handful of other common backyard plants that nobody planted and most people cannot name. Which means this is not a rare event that happens to unlucky families in remote places, since it is one of the most routine calls a poison center takes during late summer. The reason it stays routine is simple, because the plant is common, the berries are attractive, and the parents are almost never aware it is growing at the back of the yard. The compounds involved are a group of toxins with names like phytolactotoxin and phytolactiginin, along with a family of soap-like compounds called saponins. They act primarily on the digestive tract, and the typical result of a child eating berries is nausea, vomiting, stomach cramping, and diarrhea beginning within a few hours. In more serious exposures, particularly with larger amounts or with parts of the plant other than the berries, the effects can extend well beyond the stomach, and hospitalization becomes necessary. There is a detail here that explains why outcomes vary so much, and it is worth knowing. A ripe berry swallowed whole often passes through without releasing its full toxic load. Because most of the toxin sits in the seed, and an intact seed can travel through the digestive system unopened. A berry that is chewed, or a handful of unripe green berries, is a substantially different situation, which means the amount, the ripeness, and whether the child chewed them all matter. And none of that is something a parent can assess in the moment. So the rule is simple, and it does not change, because any ingestion of this plant by a child is a call to poison control immediately, without waiting to see what develops. Now here is the part of this story that surprises nearly everyone. Across the American South, this same plant has been a traditional spring food for generations, and it has a name. Poke salad, spelled with an A, from an old word for cooked greens rather than a salad. Families gathered the very young shoots and leaves in early spring, when the plant was only a few inches tall, before the stem had turned that deep magenta color. They boiled those young leaves, poured off the water completely, boiled them again in fresh water, and in many families poured that off and boiled them a third time. Then they cooked the result with bacon grease or fried it with eggs, and it was a genuine seasonal staple in rural households, particularly during periods when fresh food ran short at the end of winter. There are towns that still hold poke salad festivals every year, and there is a well-known song from 1969 that put the tradition into American popular culture. So how do those two facts sit together, given everything I just told you about the toxins? The answer is that the tradition depends on three conditions being met exactly. The first condition is the stage of growth, because only the very young shoots were used, before the plant matured and before the stem developed that red-purple coloring. The second condition is the part, since the root was never used under any circumstances and the berries were never eaten. The third condition is the preparation, because the repeated boiling with the water discarded each time was not a matter of taste, and it was the step that made the food safe. That knowledge was passed down carefully from a grandmother to a mother to a child in a specific place, with the details intact. And this is where I have to be honest with you, because this is exactly the kind of tradition that becomes dangerous when it travels without its details. Someone who reads that poke salad is a southern delicacy, walks out to a 6-foot plant with a purple stem in August, and cooks the leaves once, has not followed the tradition at all. They have taken the name and dropped every single condition that made it work. Cases still occur where people are hospitalized after preparing this plant incorrectly, and the pattern is almost always the same, involving either a plant that was too mature or a preparation that skipped the repeated boiling. So the honest position on poke salad is this, and I am not going to soften it. It is a real tradition with genuine cultural history behind it. It was done safely for generations by people who learned it hands-on from someone who knew, and it is not something to attempt from a video or a paragraph on the internet. If you did not learn it from someone who has done it their whole life, this is a plant to know by sight and leave alone. Now let me show you something that makes this plant genuinely fascinating, rather than simply dangerous. Birds eat these berries constantly in large quantities, and they are completely unaffected. Mockingbirds, cardinals, robins, and dozens of other species strip these clusters through late summer and autumn, and pokeweed is a significant food source for them. The reason birds are fine and we are not comes down to how differently their digestive systems process the fruit, since the seeds pass through a bird intact without releasing the toxins concentrated inside them. And that relationship is the entire reason this plant shows up in your yard without anyone planting it. A bird eats berries in a woodlot, flies to your fence line, and deposits the seeds directly beneath its perch, which is precisely why pokeweed appears along fences, under power lines, beside sheds, and at the edges of tree lines. The plant is not spreading randomly, because it is being planted deliberately and efficiently by birds using exactly the perches you would expect. There is a second consequence of that toxicity that Americans use for 200 years. The juice of these berries produces an intense magenta red dye, and it was widely used as ink. There are accounts of Civil War soldiers writing letters home using pokeberry juice when ink ran short, and the plant was used for coloring fabric and other materials throughout early American history. The color is genuinely beautiful and notoriously unstable, since it fades with time and light, which is part of why it never became a commercial dye of any importance. The plant that hospitalizes children was also, for a long stretch of American history, a source of ink and color for people who had no other option. Now let me cover the lookalikes, because misidentification runs in both directions here. The first is wild grape, And this is the confusion that matters most for children, since both produce hanging clusters of dark purple fruit. The differences are obvious to an adult who stops to look, because a wild grape is a woody, climbing vine with curling tendrils that grip whatever it climbs, and its leaves are broad and lobed with toothed edges. Pokeweed is a self-supporting plant with a thick, soft magenta stem, no tendrils, no climbing habit, and large, smooth-edged leaves. The second is elderberry, which produces dark purple fruit that people genuinely harvest for syrup and jam. Elderberry is a woody shrub with compound leaves, meaning each leaf is made up of several leaflets arranged along a stalk, and its berries sit in broad, flat-topped clusters held upward rather than in long, drooping strings. Pokeweed has simple, undivided leaves, a soft, herbaceous stem, and berries that hang downward on a raceme. So the shorthand is that a woody stem with tendrils is grape, a woody shrub with compound leaves and flat clusters is elderberry, and a soft magenta stem with drooping strings of berries is pokeweed. Now the section that matters more than anything else in this video. If a child eats any part of this plant, contact poison control immediately. And in the United States, that number is 1-800-222, so 2022. Make that call before you decide whether it looks serious, because the value of the call is in the timing and the professional assessment. Do not attempt to induce vomiting unless a medical professional specifically instructs you to, since that advice has changed, and doing it incorrectly can make the situation worse. If you can do so quickly, take a photograph of the plant or bring a piece of it with you, because confirming the species helps the medical team more than a description ever will. Watch for symptoms that go beyond stomach upset, meaning any difficulty breathing, unusual drowsiness, or collapse, and treat those as an emergency requiring immediate care. And if you handle this plant yourself when clearing it, wear gloves, because the sap can be absorbed through skin and through any small cuts on your hands. That last point matters particularly if you are removing a mature plant, since the root is enormous and the most toxic part, and digging it out is exactly the activity that puts sap on your forearms. Which brings me to removal, and there's a practical detail here that catches people. Pokeweed grows from a large, deep taproot that survives the winter underground, and the plant dies back to that root every year and returns from it the following spring. Cutting the top off does very little because the root simply sends up new growth, and a well-established root can be several inches thick and go down a long way. The realistic approach is to remove young plants while their roots are still small, to wear gloves and long sleeves whenever you do it, and to be aware that mature specimens usually require repeated effort across seasons. And if you have small children, the highest priority is the berries themselves, so cutting the fruiting stems off before the berries ripen removes the actual hazard, even if the plant itself remains. Now the honest limits, because I would rather give you a real picture than an alarming one. This plant causes serious illness and it results in a great many poison control calls every year, with most involving children, and it deserves genuine respect. Most of those cases resolve without permanent harm, particularly where the child ate only a small number of ripe berries and received prompt medical attention. The danger is real, and the appropriate response is knowledge and prompt action rather than panic. None of this is medical advice, because what I have given you is identification and a plan, while the medical response belongs to poison control and to a physician. Let me leave you with the thing about this plant that I find genuinely worth thinking about. Pokeweed is native to this continent, and it was here long before any of the yards it now grows in. Indigenous peoples across its range knew this plant thoroughly, understood which parts could be prepared and which could not, and used it as food, as medicine, and as dye, with the specific knowledge required to do that safely. Rural American families carried a version of that knowledge forward for another 2 centuries, taught hands-on in kitchens by people who had learned it from someone else. And then, in roughly 2 generations, most of us stopped learning any of it, at exactly the moment we started spending our lives in yards where this plant grows unnoticed at the back fence. The plant did not become more dangerous, because what changed is that we stopped being taught what it was, so here is the whole of it in the form you can actually use. There's a tall plant with a bright magenta stem, large, smooth leaves, and long, drooping clusters of glossy, dark berries growing along fence lines and in the neglected corners of American yards. Every part of it is toxic, the root most of all, and the berries are the part children reach for because they hang at hand height and look exactly like grapes. If a child eats any of it, call poison control immediately rather than waiting to see what happens. Wear gloves if you clear it, cut the berry clusters off before they ripen if you have small children, and remove young plants before their roots establish. And teach the plant by sight to every child who plays in that yard, because a 5-year-old who can point at a magenta stem and say pokeweed is a 5-year-old who walks past it. That teaching works better than most parents expect, and it works better than a rule does. A blanket instruction to never eat berries fails, because children forget rules, and because berries are genuinely everywhere, and a child who has been told nothing specific will eventually test the rule against a berry that looks harmless. What actually works is making the plant itself familiar. So walk them to it, point at the pink stem, let them look at the hanging clusters, and give it a name they can repeat. Children are remarkably good at learning specific plants by sight, in the same way they learn to recognize particular dogs or cars, and a plant with a name stops being generic scenery. And it is worth extending that to pets as well, since dogs will chew at low-hanging fruit and livestock will browse this plant in an overgrown pasture corner, and both are affected by the same toxins that affect us. So tell me down in the comments whether this plant is growing where you live, and whether you knew what it was before today. And if your family has its own poke salad tradition, I would genuinely like to hear how it was taught to you, because that kind of knowledge is exactly what disappears when nobody writes it down. I read every single one. Next time, I'm going to show you a plant growing in that same fence line that most Americans spray with weed killer every spring, that half the world eats as a vegetable, and that is one of the most nutritious wild plants on this continent. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and remember that the plants which cause the most harm are almost never the ones that look dangerous.